There's a story about two people who earned almost the same amount of money. One of them slept well at night, the other didn't. The difference wasn't income. It wasn't intelligence. It wasn't even financial discipline in the way we usually talk about it. The difference was something quieter, harder to see, and far more powerful. One of them felt scarce. The other didn't. Here's what's interesting about scarcity. It doesn't begin when money is low. It begins when certainty is low. I once met someone who had more savings than they ever imagined they'd have in their 20s. On paper, they were doing great. Stable job, growing investments, no major debt. If you looked at their life from the outside, you'd assume money stress was behind them. But every conversation about money carried tension. Every unexpected expense felt like a threat. Every market dip felt personal. They were constantly bracing for impact, even when nothing was wrong. Meanwhile, someone else with fewer resources spoke calmly about the future. Not because they had everything figured out, but because they trusted they'd adapt. That contrast reveals the core truth of scarcity. It's not about what you have, it's about what you fear losing. Which brings us to the first idea. Scarcity is a mindset built from past experiences, not current numbers. Psychologically, this makes sense. Our brains don't measure safety in spreadsheets. They measure it through memory. If you've ever lived through instability, job loss, debt, family stress, unpredictable income, your nervous system learns a lesson. It learns that money can disappear suddenly, and once that lesson is learned, it doesn't automatically unlearn itself when circumstances improve. Here's the paradox. The more you climb financially, without addressing that fear, the more you have to lose, and the more intense the anxiety can become. Historically, this pattern shows up again and again. People who lived through the Great Depression carried scarcity with them for decades, even when prosperity returned. They saved obsessively, avoided risk, feared waste. Their behavior wasn't irrational, it was protective. Today, the context looks different, but the psychology is the same. Someone who graduated into a recession or watched parents struggle may carry that same internal alarm system. Even in abundance, the mind whispers, "Don't get comfortable." Nobody's crazy for this. Scarcity is an emotional memory, not a logical conclusion. The invisible part is that this mindset quietly shapes decisions long after the original threat is gone. It influences how much risk you take, how much joy you allow yourself to feel, and how tightly you cling to control. Which leads to the second idea. Scarcity narrows your thinking in ways you don't notice while it's happening. There's a fascinating psychological effect where scarcity compresses your mental bandwidth. When resources feel limited, your focus shrinks. You start optimizing for short-term relief instead of long-term growth. Think about how hunger affects decision-making. When you're starving, you don't think about nutrition or balance. You think about calories, right now. The same thing happens with money. When scarcity is running the show, every decision feels urgent. You obsess over small costs. You delay meaningful investments. You hesitate to take risks that could improve your future because the present feels too fragile. Here's what's interesting about that. Scarcity makes people look disciplined from the outside while quietly undermining them on the inside. You might budget perfectly, save diligently, and avoid obvious mistakes. But if every decision is driven by fear, you're not building freedom. You're building a cage that feels responsible. The paradox is this. Trying to eliminate all financial uncertainty often creates more stress, not less. Historically, this shows up in how people react during times of uncertainty. When environments feel unpredictable, people retreat into hyper-control. They hoard cash, avoid change, delay decisions. It feels safe in the moment, but it often leads to missed opportunities and long-term stagnation. Modern examples are everywhere. People staying in jobs they dislike not because the job is good, but because leaving feels risky. People avoiding investments not because they don't understand them, but because uncertainty feels unbearable. Scarcity doesn't just limit money, it limits imagination. The invisible cost here is optionality. When your mind is consumed by fear of loss, you stop seeing paths forward. You focus on survival instead of possibility. Which brings us to the third idea. Scarcity turns progress into pressure. Have you ever noticed how reaching a financial milestone doesn't always bring relief? Sometimes it brings more anxiety, more responsibility, more fear of falling backward. That's because scarcity reframes progress as something fragile. Every gain feels temporary. Every improvement feels like something that must be defended. Here's the paradox. When abundance is viewed through a scarcity lens, it becomes exhausting instead of empowering. I know people who increased their income and felt more stressed, not less. Their lifestyle didn't explode. Their habits didn't change dramatically. But internally, the stakes felt higher. There was more to protect now, more to worry about. Historically, this is why rising prosperity often coincides with rising anxiety. As standards improve, expectations rise faster. The baseline shifts. What once felt like enough becomes the new minimum. The invisible part is that scarcity doesn't allow you to enjoy progress. It turns every step forward into a reminder of what you could lose. This is why some of the most financially successful people still feel behind. Not because they are behind, but because scarcity redefines success as something always just out of reach. Understanding this doesn't mean scarcity disappears overnight. It means you stop blaming yourself for feeling stressed even when things look okay. Because scarcity is not a personal failure, it's a learned response. And once you see it that way, a new question emerges. If scarcity is learned, can it be unlearned? That's where things start to get interesting. There's a story about a man who finally reached the income level he used to dream about. Not suddenly, not through luck, but steadily, year after year. Promotions, raises, stability. On paper, his financial life looked calm, even boring in the best way. But his behavior didn't change. He still checked his bank balance multiple times a day. He still hesitated before buying things he genuinely enjoyed. He still felt a tight knot in his stomach whenever an unexpected expense appeared, a car repair, a medical bill, a travel disruption. Nothing catastrophic, but each one felt like proof that something fragile could break. It was as if his life had upgraded, but his internal software hadn't. Here's what's interesting about that. Scarcity doesn't respond to progress the way we assume it should. This brings us to the fourth idea. Scarcity survives because it confuses safety with control. Most people believe peace comes from having enough money, a certain number, a milestone, a finish line. But psychologically, peace doesn't come from how much you have. It comes from how capable you believe you are of handling what happens next. Those are not the same thing. Control feels comforting. Predictable budgets, emergency funds, backup plans for backup plans. None of these are bad. They're smart, responsible, often necessary. But scarcity sneaks in when control becomes the goal instead of resilience. Evolution explains why this happens. For most of human history, losing resources wasn't inconvenient. It was dangerous. Food shortages meant starvation. Shelter loss meant exposure. Social exclusion meant vulnerability. Our brains learned that survival depended on tightly managing what we had. Letting go felt reckless. Uncertainty felt threatening. That wiring didn't disappear when modern financial systems arrived. It just adapted to spreadsheets, apps, and forecasts. Here's the paradox. The more you try to control every financial outcome, the more fragile you feel when life inevitably deviates from the plan. Historically, this shows up during long periods of calm. When things go right for a long time, people don't just relax. They grow confident that uncertainty has been solved. They start believing stability is permanent. In those moments, people don't merely save more. They seek certainty, guarantees, fixed outcomes. They want to believe nothing bad will happen because the system feels orderly. But money can't offer guarantees. It can only offer buffers. The invisible part is that control-based thinking quietly increases anxiety. When your sense of safety depends on things going exactly as planned, every surprise feels like a personal threat instead of a normal feature of life. Modern life amplifies this tension. We're surrounded by projections, forecasts, retirement calculators that pretend 30-year futures can be mapped precisely. When reality inevitably diverges from those projections, it feels like failure instead of normal variation. Nobody's crazy for reacting this way, but it explains why scarcity persists even when finances improve. Because the underlying fear isn't actually about money, it's about unpredictability. Which leads to the fifth idea. Scarcity turns flexibility into a threat instead of an asset. Think about how people with a scarcity mindset react to change. New opportunities feel risky. Career shifts feel dangerous. Investing feels like gambling. Even positive changes carry anxiety because they disrupt what's familiar. Here's what's interesting about that. Flexibility is one of the most powerful forms of financial strength, but scarcity trains us to avoid it. Historically, the people who endured the longest weren't the ones who predicted the future best. They were the ones who adapted fastest. They changed strategies when conditions changed. They moved locations, shifted skills, adjusted expectations. Flexibility wasn't optional, it was survival. The paradox is this: scarcity convinces you that staying still is safe, even when staying still is what slowly erodes your options. Modern examples are everywhere. Someone stays in a stable but draining job because the paycheck feels safe, even as stress compounds year after year. Someone avoids learning new skills because it feels uncomfortable, even though stagnation quietly increases long-term risk. Scarcity narrows time horizons. It focuses attention on what could go wrong tomorrow and ignores what could quietly go wrong over decades. The invisible cost here is confidence, not arrogance, not bravado, but quiet confidence in your ability to adjust. People without a scarcity mindset don't believe nothing bad will happen. They believe they respond when it does. That belief changes everything. It affects how you invest, how you negotiate, how you spend, how you rest. It allows you to think in ranges instead of absolutes, probabilities instead of certainties, paths instead of plans carved in stone. Nobody talks about this, but breaking scarcity isn't about convincing yourself you have enough. It's about trusting yourself to adapt if things change. This is why two people with identical finances can experience completely different levels of stress. One believes safety comes from freezing life in place. The other believes safety comes from motion. The invisible shift happens when you stop asking, "How do I prevent anything bad from happening?" and start asking, "How prepared am I to respond if it does?" That's a psychological upgrade, not a financial one. Understanding this doesn't instantly erase fear. I struggle with this too. Old habits don't disappear just because we recognize them. Scarcity is persistent because it once served a real purpose. But awareness loosens its grip. Scarcity loses some of its power when you realize it's trying to protect you with outdated tools. Tools built for a world where uncertainty meant danger, not inconvenience. And once you see that, a deeper question emerges. If scarcity is rooted in fear of unpredictability, what actually builds lasting calm? The answer isn't more control. It isn't perfect planning. It isn't chasing a higher number. It's something quieter, more durable, and far less talked about. That's where the real shift begins. There's a story about two people who lived through the same financial shock, same market downturn, same economic headlines, same uncertainty. On paper, their losses looked almost identical, but emotionally, they experienced two completely different worlds. One person felt panic almost immediately. Every decision felt urgent. Every headline felt personal. Sleep suffered. Conversations revolved around fear. Money became the lens through which everything else was judged. The other person didn't feel calm. Let's be clear about that. They felt concern, tension, discomfort, but they didn't feel trapped. They didn't feel like their identity was under threat. They didn't feel like one bad you defined their entire future. The difference wasn't intelligence, or income, or preparation. It was how they related to uncertainty. Here's what's interesting about that. Scarcity isn't just about how much you have. It's about how you interpret change. This brings us to the sixth idea. Scarcity shrinks your sense of time, while abundance expands it. When scarcity is active, everything feels immediate. The brain zooms in on the present moment. Bills due now. Losses happening today. Risks right in front of you. The future collapses into a single point of anxiety. Evolution explains this too. When resources were scarce, long-term thinking was dangerous. Survival required focus on the next meal, the next threat, the next shelter. Planning too far ahead didn't help if you didn't make it through the week. That instinct still lives inside us. Here's the paradox. The more you worry about short-term survival, the harder it becomes to build long-term security. Historically, this shows up in cycles of boom and bust. During hard times, people make decisions that feel protective in the moment, but costly over decades. Selling at the wrong time, avoiding opportunity, choosing immediate relief over future flexibility. Nobody's crazy for doing this. When fear is loud, patience feels irresponsible, but the invisible cost is optionality, the ability to wait, to adapt, to let time do its work. People who break out of scarcity don't eliminate fear. They stretch their time horizon despite it. They remember that one bad year rarely defines a life, that progress is uneven, that setbacks are part of any long journey worth taking, that perspective doesn't come from optimism, it comes from experience and self-trust, which leads to the seventh and most important idea. Scarcity breaks when you redefine what enough actually means. Most people think enough is a number, a salary, a net worth, a lifestyle. But psychologically, enough is a feeling. It's the moment when your decisions stop being driven primarily by fear. Here's what's interesting about that. You can reach a high income and still never feel enough. And you can have far less and feel calm if your expectations align with your reality. The paradox is this: chasing enough often prevents you from feeling enough. Historically, the people who felt most secure weren't always the wealthiest. They were the ones whose needs grew slower than their resources. They resisted lifestyle inflation not out of discipline, but out of clarity. They understood that every upgrade comes with invisible obligations, more stress, less flexibility, higher fixed costs, fewer options. The invisible part is freedom. Freedom to say no. Freedom to wait. Freedom to change course. Scarcity hides this by convincing you that more is always safer, but more can just as easily become heavier. Modern culture makes this especially hard. We're constantly shown what other people have: bigger houses, faster success, earlier milestones. It creates the impression that falling behind is dangerous. But nobody talks about the quiet relief of stepping off that treadmill. Breaking scarcity doesn't mean rejecting ambition. It means choosing ambition deliberately instead of reactively. It means asking a different question, not how do I get more, but what am I trying to protect? For some people, it's time. For others, health. For others, relationships. For others, autonomy. Once you know that answer, money stops being the source of safety and becomes a tool for supporting what you value. This is where scarcity finally loosens its grip, because scarcity thrives on vagueness, undefined fears, undefined goals, undefined finish lines. Clarity is its opposite. That doesn't mean life becomes easy. Unexpected things will still happen. Markets will still surprise you. Expenses will still show up uninvited. But your reaction changes. Instead of panic, there's perspective. Instead of paralysis, there's adjustment. Instead of feeling judged by every outcome, you see events as data points in a long story. The real skill isn't avoiding stress. It's building a life where stress doesn't make the decisions for you. I don't always get this right. Scarcity still whispers to me sometimes. It shows up when I'm tired, or uncertain, or comparing myself to others. But I've learned to recognize it for what it is: a protective instinct using outdated rules. And once you see that, you can thank it for trying to help without letting it run the show. Think back to the man from earlier, the one whose income rose but whose anxiety didn't. His breakthrough didn't come from earning more. It came from realizing that he'd already survived far more uncertainty than he gave himself credit for. That realization changed how money felt. Not abundant, not careless, but calm. That's the real opposite of scarcity. Not wealth, not excess, calm. And calm doesn't come from predicting the future perfectly. It comes from trusting yourself to meet it when it arrives. So the real question isn't how much money you'll have someday. It's how you want to feel while you're getting there. If this changed how you think about stress, money, or scarcity, let me know. And if you're curious about how these invisible psychological forces shape other parts of our financial lives, we'll keep exploring them together.